of course, Michael mentions Harvard and Columbia. Of course, some of you are wondering, how'd they let this jerk into the room? But I've made it my life's goal to make the admissions committees of those universities regret the day they ever admitted me. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to be here with you folks, and I do a lot of public speaking, but I have to ration my travel carefully because I leave behind a wonderful wife and 4 little children every time I leave. And the 4 little children range in age from 7 months to 7 years. And they're all girls. I'm not even going to make a joke, right? You could come up with much better ones than I could, right? But it's interesting to note, by the way, just how politically aware a 7-year-old can become without you even realizing it. And so, for example, just the other day, this is actually true. My 7-year-old, Regina, is having a discussion with a 7-year-old friend of hers, and this friend reads a lot of old-timey stories, like 19th century stories. And one of these stories involved purchasing some candy with a penny, like the idea of penny candy, which persisted into the 20th century, of course. And so her friend is saying to her, Regina, what do you think of this story? It seems silly to me because everybody knows a penny buys hardly anything. And Regina replied, yeah, thanks to the Fed. So she's listening in to my conversations. And the other thing the other day, now this is difficult because my wife is as outspoken as I am, but nevertheless, she has to interact with a lot of different mothers who have different political views, and she doesn't always want to be engaged in political debate, while she's food shopping or whatever. So I don't know where they were, but at one time somebody asked my daughter, so Regina, they wanted to see how knowledgeable she was. Regina, do you know who the president is? And she said, Obama, and then paused and said, he likes to take people's money. My wife is just mortified at this. Like, how do I explain this away? What are you teaching this kid? They're going to take this kid away from us, for heaven's sake. But really, to be able to spend this time with you guys, it's really an honor for me because it is really a small sliver of humanity that on Labor Day weekend says, I think I'm going to go to a constitutional seminar. Amazing, wonderful, thank you. And you still have 2 perfectly good days to grill. It's fine. But you'll be grilling with giant brains because you came to this seminar. And man, a giant brain makes the best burger. I'm telling you. All right, well look folks, it is a testament to 3 things that we've been able to have a successful meeting like this on a day like this. First, again, to all of you, that you came here in complete defiance of the New York Times and MSNBC and the entire apparatus of fashionable opinion, which would forbid you to attend an event like this. This kind of topic is completely off the table. And that's why you're here. Isn't that wonderful? The more off the table it is, the more I want to know about it. Second, of course, these things don't just occur spontaneously. They occur because people put them together. We have great leaders like Michael Bolden, who's a guy from California who just started the 10th Amendment Center. And Trevor Lyman, also from WeRefuse.com. And then look at all the different groups who are co-sponsoring this event. All different kinds of groups, and some of them are 9/12 groups, some of them are Tea Party groups, some of them are entirely independent groups. We all came together, and we don't all agree with each other on everything. So, wonderful. All that means is we're not a cult. Good, okay? Fine. We have disagreements, but we share so much in common that it's wonderful that we are opening up the lines of communication with each other here. Because few enough are the people in this country who are prepared to stand up to the regime. Let's not let our petty squabbles get in the way of forming some friendships and some alliances. There is strength in numbers here. But thirdly, how do you put on an event like this, on a forbidden topic like this, The internet. Now, we all hear a lot of cliches about the internet has liberated this and that, but these aren't cliches, these are true. Until the internet, opinion was basically shaped by what are sometimes called gatekeepers, like the New York Times or MSNBC or all the official channels of opinion, and they sort of decide what the debates are going to be. So they'll decide that, well, we're allowed to debate should the top marginal federal tax rate be 39.1 or 39.0%. We're allowed to debate that. We peons are allowed to debate that subject. We can debate the form in which we're looted. Well, gee, should they loot us? Should they take half our income this way or that way? They're perfectly fine if that's what we're debating. But to bring something onto the table like this is unthinkable. That's why gatekeepers exist, is precisely to keep out ideas like this, precisely to stop any attempt by the people to regain their liberties, and when you see the people get uppity, you immediately squash it. Oh, that's not respectable. Why? That's not a respectable idea. I mean, Newsweek doesn't even mention it. How respectable could it be? That's how they expect us to think. They expect us to think like zombies. But because of the internet, we're no longer giving them the satisfaction. Because the gatekeepers are still there. It's true, they're still in New York Times, at least for now. Ha ha ha. There's still an MSNBC and the whole apparatus. They're still there. The gates are still up, but thanks to the internet, the walls are down. You don't have to get your information from Pravda Central anymore. You can get it from sources you actually trust that'll tell you the truth. And so now we can bring up topics like this. Because we weren't going to learn about them in Newsweek or U.S. News and World Report or any of these papers. We weren't going to learn about them that way. We learn about them because we see a video about them on the internet. Or because we read some article on the internet. We're getting around the gatekeepers and making this possible. We have a way, in other words, to reach each other directly and not through the intermediaries of these people and institutions. So instead of wasting our time on the pointless debates that the gatekeepers would prefer, we can change the whole range of discussion. And that's, in effect, what made possible this recent upsurge of interest in state nullification. Now, let me give you just a capsule version of some of the stuff we've heard, but really with my own amplification. What we're talking about here are ideas that are eminently American, but which have fallen down the Orwellian memory hole. They're just down there, way, way, way down. And our overlords sort of assumed that we would never find them again. Because, as I say, Time magazine doesn't talk about them, so can the peons even remember that they exist? Well, see, what they forgot about us is that we have very, very long, retractable arms. We can reach down in there, fish around, and say, what's in that Jeffersonian toolkit that they don't want me to know about? And pull it back up and learn about it. In 1798, we got two documents that are seminal in American history and that have been completely forgotten, and of course I mean the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of 1798. Now the fact that that even gets applause is significant. 3 years ago, people would say, what in the world is this guy talking about? And I wouldn't blame them. I wouldn't say, these people got a terrible education. I wouldn't blame them. That's the whole point, is to suppress documents like this. In fact, in 1998, 200 years later, does anybody recall Bill Clinton holding a White House soiree in honor of the 200th anniversary of these documents? No, of course not. You could hear crickets, right? There was no response whatsoever. But in those documents, we have, respectively, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson urging us that the states have a constitutional role to play. In the Virginia resolutions, we learn that when the federal government goes beyond its constitutional powers, that the states are duty-bound to resist. Now notice he didn't say, well, you might consider resisting, or maybe you could flip a coin, and if it comes up heads, you would resist. The states are duty-bound to resist. Thomas Jefferson, who drafted the Kentucky resolutions of 1798, in his initial draft, as well as in the follow-up resolutions of 1799, said that a nullification is the rightful remedy in a situation like this. So Jefferson came up with that word. It wasn't me. It wasn't any of us. It was Thomas Jefferson. Media and political overlords would like to take this up with Thomas Jefferson. They're absolutely free to. But if it boils down to Keith Olbermann versus Thomas Jefferson and me, I think I like those odds. In 1800, Virginia issued a report, sometimes known as Madison's Report, following up on the Virginia resolutions of 1798. And in those follow-up resolutions, Madison clarified that we need a remedy for when even the judicial branch betrays us. So it's not enough to say, oh, the courts will put things right. That's not what Madison thought. We need a remedy for when the courts betray us. The courts are not composed of infallible human beings, because there's no such thing. In fact, think about Thomas Jefferson's attitude toward the federal courts. His argument was the federal courts are part of the problem. I mean, you want me to go and refer my disputes to them? They're part of the problem. The problem is the federal government, and last I checked, the federal courts are part of the federal government. They can't possibly be impartial arbiters. And the example I often give on the radio is, I say to the radio host, let's suppose you and I had a dispute. I know this would never happen, but let's suppose we did. And then I said to you, I have just the person to adjudicate this dispute. How about my mother? Now look, my mother, you know, she's still alive, and I want to say in her honor, and with respect to her, she's a very fair-minded person. She might side with the other guy. I wouldn't bet on it, though. I mean, you know, we have known each other a long time. So, in other words, this is clear, right? You don't, when two parties are having a dispute, you don't let one of the parties of the dispute render the decision. And so the idea of state nullification, that the states formed the federal government in the first place, they are the principals. The federal government is merely their agent. The employee does not tell the employer what to do. Try doing that, by the way. See what happens. That is not how it is supposed to work. And in parentheses, by the way, if you're ever faced with this objection, sometimes you get this objection. Yeah, I understand the original 13 states, they had convention, they sent delegates to the Constitutional Convention, and then they ratified the Constitution. So they created the federal government, I got it. But what about the other 37? Didn't the federal government create those 37? So what happens to your argument then? This is so wrong, I can't even, there aren't words in the English language to emphasize how wrong this is. And I'll just give you the quick version of why that's wrong. The American understanding is not that the federal government creates states. The people create the state, and then the state applies for admission to the Union as a state. So when the people draft their state constitution and approach the federal government, at that point they are a state already. And so when Jefferson was confronted with the situation in 1820 involving Missouri, he was facing a situation in which Missouri had indeed drafted a state constitution and was applying for admission to the Union. And Jefferson said to them, if you are turned down for admission to the Union, then you will simply be an independent state. So in other words, your statehood does not rely on ratification by the federal government. Your statehood comes from the sovereignty of your people. So this 37 thing is not an objection. Another thing about the federal courts, by the way, the Jeffersonian view is that they're probably just going to rubber stamp what the federal government is doing. Well, how many times can one guy be a prophet? You know, like a zillion? I mean, of course he's right. That's exactly what they do. What do the federal courts spend most of their time doing these days? Going after the states. Because apparently they're all finished going over the constitutionality of federal laws. They've done all that. So they've got a lot of spare time, and they're going to... I mean, you would think that would keep them busy enough, but no, on to the states. Now, where does all this come from? I mean, did Jefferson just come up with this while he was drunk, and then he drafted them, and he woke up the next morning and said, oh my gosh, I hope I didn't submit these. Look, they're crazy, drunken nonsense. No! This comes from the Virginia Ratifying Convention of 1788. Now, Virginia is arguably the most important of the early states. Think of how many of our important statesmen come from Virginia. And when they were considering whether or not to ratify the Constitution, they were faced with a bunch of skeptics like Patrick Henry, who looked at the document and said, there are clauses here that they will be able to drive, I'd like to say a truck through, I guess that would be anachronistic, be able to gallop a horse through. So what do we do about this? And what was he told? Patrick Henry was told something by the 5-man commission, whose job it was to write the ratification instrument, that is the document by which Virginia would ratify the Constitution. So these aren't just 5 bozos. These are arguably the 5 most important people at the convention. And they said to him, Edmund Randolph, future Attorney General, said, "Oh, don't worry about it. This federal government is going to have only the powers expressly delegated to it." He used the word expressly. This is a limited government. George Nicholas, who became the first Attorney General of Kentucky, who also served on this 5-man commission, said, "Oh, and by the way, if the federal government should try to reach for any supplementary condition," those were his words, "to impose upon us, we will be, in Virginia, exonerated from that additional power because we never agreed to it. We're only agreeing to the powers in Article 1, Section 8. Well, there's nullification pretty much in germ right there. Now, how many students learn about that in school? I mean, I guess we could probably safely round it off to 0, right? I mean, this is just gone. It's just down the memory hole. And yet there it is. It's sitting there right in the records. I mean, I didn't make this up. It's just sitting there waiting to be rediscovered. So again, Jefferson is just building on this original idea. And I talk all about, and if you're wondering, where am I going to find out about this? I'm going to mention a little bit about my book later. I noticed that in the program on the website it says Tom's going to talk about his new book, and I feel like that's a little narcissistic. Like, hey, let me tell you all about my book. It's super cool. It's got all these chapters in it. So I'm only going to make a couple references to it, but that's what this book, which I indeed am selling out there, is about. And it's got all this information. You can, and I urge you, check my sources. Follow them up. Go online and look up a lot of these old things that are now thankfully available online. And you'll see it's all in there. It's all there. There's a real history, a real and honorable history of the employment of the so-called Principles of 98, named after the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of 1798. A lot of people say, oh, that was... In fact, I was on a radio show in Missouri not too long ago, and the host loved our interview and said, I want you to come on again tomorrow. Came on again tomorrow, and she said, you know, after listening to you, I wondered why constitutional conservatives weren't all getting on board for this. It just seems like a logical sort of thing. Why aren't they all getting on board for it? And then I looked around, I talked to people, and they said, well, the answer is the terrible checkered history of this idea. And I said, oh yeah, well, what do you have in mind? Like, can you give me an example? She said, well, you know, slavery. And I said, all right, I understand that, well, I didn't put it quite this snarkily, but I understand that every time you mention the states, people think slavery. However, that is not a substitute for historical analysis. Nullification was never used on behalf of slavery, ever. So where are they even getting this? I mean, they just think, well, anybody who talks about the states has sinister intentions. It's interesting, by the way, to reflect that the biggest opponent of states' rights in the 20th century was Hitler. You read Mein Kampf, which not a lot of us do in our spare time, but if you were to flip through to the states' rights section, he doesn't go for it at all. He says, well, wait a minute, I want to impose the Nazi ideology on the whole country. I don't care about your crummy state boundaries. I'm going to wipe out all those state boundaries. No. Every tyrant who ever lived has spoken that way. So this is the way to turn it around on those who say that we must be would-be dictators who want to impose terrible things on the people by means of states' rights. Every tyrant in the world wants to suppress the powers of states so that they can impose their will on the whole undifferentiated mass of the population. So, oh, thanks. Thank you. So the real history of the powers of the states and the Principles of 98 in America, not the phony baloney one that people think they learned in 7th grade, but the real one is eminently honorable. The New England states employed these principles in defense of their right to engage in commerce against the Jeffersonian embargo. They used it to fight against unconstitutional searches and seizures. And they used it even to fight against what they perceived to be unconstitutional aspects of the fugitive slave laws. So this is an actual history. These things actually happen. But again, how many students learn about any of this? It's like nothing. It's like, again, crickets. No mention of this whatsoever. I leave it to you folks as an exercise to determine why it is that all of this would have been conveniently forgotten. But what it all boils down to is this. The federal government will not and should not be expected to limit itself. That ain't going to happen. You do not establish an institution like this, then hand it a piece of paper and say, go limit yourself. What possible incentive does this institution have to limit itself? So it's enough to dangle, we've tried dangling carrots in front of it. It's time for the stick, I say. Because if it is going to be limited, if that's even possible, obviously something outside itself has to do the limiting. Just common sense. Well, according to Jefferson, the logical candidate for that role would be the states. That is their role. As the principals to the compact, they determine when the compact has been broken. And as I say, the original intent, when you look at that crucial Virginia ratifying convention, where it's clear, we have the power to be exonerated when the federal government goes beyond its legitimate powers. I mean, that's how you go to find out what the Constitution means. You look at what the ratifiers thought they were getting themselves into. That's a general legal principle. That, for example, if I were a judge and I were looking at somebody's will, I would want to know what were the intentions of the testator. I would always want to know what were the intentions of those who drafted this. And here we see, I mean, it's as clear as day that at the very least there is an extremely plausible line of historical argument that leads us to the validity of the principles of '98. Now, I recommend, because we've also had imposed on us the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, which I don't have time to talk about tonight, but that has, I think, crippled the states to some degree. A way to restore some of this to the states might be this. Let's suppose we had this rule enacted, that if a simple majority of the states, just 26 states, and it doesn't matter how they go about it, they could have their attorney general do it, they could have their legislature vote on it, they could have a popular referendum, the means doesn't matter. The point is, if we had 26 states say that a particular federal law was unconstitutional, then it's thereby repealed. Repealed. Now, that's not quite the same thing as nullification, which deals only with one state at a time. But it bears a family resemblance to the principles of '98, because the idea is that something outside the federal government does the limiting. Now, we have precious little influence, sometimes we feel, over our state legislatures. But we have infinitely more influence over them than we do over the U.S. Senate, which their whole career involves ignoring us completely. That's part of the job description. So there's no way almost to reach them, but we can, if we had some way in which our states could collectively have a negative, just 26 of them, we might actually repeal a federal law. I mean, and now I know that there are people in this country in the media class who think if a federal law were ever repealed, because of course this never happens, right? Something is established and then the rationale for it went away 50 years ago and now it's 100 times bigger than it ever was. They think that if we ever got rid of any federal thing, the earth would break free of its axis and go tumbling toward the sun. Well, whether that would happen or not, and I'm rather doubtful, it would happen. It could happen that we could in fact repeal things if the states in fact bolstered and amplified their constitutional role in this way. Now, people in this room, a lot of us feel like we have tried everything. We've handed out pocket constitutions, we've talked to our neighbors, we voted for this guy instead of that one, we listened to somebody give a pretty speech and therefore we said, well, this is my man, I'll vote on the basis of the speech, and then we vote. Let me point out, by the way, one thing you have to hand it to the left about is that they make their politicians actually follow through. They sit in, they make noise, they're obnoxious, they get arrested, they make noise, and then finally the politicians say, okay, I'll do it. A lot of our people hear a pretty speech, they cast a vote, and that's the end of it. The time for pretty speeches is over. And so we have tried, we feel like everything, and yet as we try these things, we go through these motions with a sense of dreary inevitability. We know government is just going to continue to grow. Maybe faster, maybe more slowly, but it's going to continue to grow. And that's how the story has gone. That's precisely how it's gone, decade after decade. And it's how every person in this room knows it's going to continue to go unless we make a radical shift in tactics. We are done playing by the rules of MSNBC and the New York Times. We can no longer afford to reject the Jeffersonian solution, which has been lying neglected for too many years. We are going to do what we should have been doing all along. We're going to follow Jefferson and his distinguished pedigree, and if that pits us against Katie Couric, Keith Olbermann, or Mitch McConnell, then so be it. And this is picking up all over the country. Next month, at the next one of these events in Florida, in Orlando, Governor Gary Johnson will be speaking. Now, this is significant. Some of you may not know who he is. He's a former New Mexico governor, two-term governor, Republican governor in a 2-to-1 Democrat state, gets reelected as governor, while at the same time vetoing more bills than all other governors combined. So for a former and politically successful governor to speak publicly at a nullification rally, first of all, the very idea of a nullification rally is unbelievable. I mean, things are changing. Just a small example, in Connecticut, the good Tea Party folks up there managed to get the Republican nomination for Attorney General for a woman named Martha Dean. Wonderful. I've got her on my website, on the front page. If you scroll down a little, she's right there on a YouTube. Martha Dean, she's giving a speech, and she says in there that, if she's elected, she's going to join in the lawsuit against Obamacare and da-da-da-da. But she also supports legislative measures, and these are her words, to nullify federal laws that are carried out via powers that were not delegated to the federal government. Now, I want us to say a few words specifically to some of the Tea Party folks we have here. We have some of those here, I guess? That was such a cheap applause line, wasn't it? Yeah, gee, we have any of those folks in here? I don't know. You guys have the potential to do great good, as you know. I was particularly thrilled about what happened in Utah earlier this year. You had a 3-term Republican senator, Bob Bennett, who just sort of figured, hey, I'm a Republican senator, 3 terms, I'm entitled to rule over you forever. Doesn't matter what I do, you guys are going to vote for me because you're suckers and I got an R next to my name. He was defeated by 2 Tea Party candidates in the primary. Because he voted for the bailouts. And so, my favorite thing ever, the head of the Utah Tea Party is on CNN, and the CNN reporter is just appalled at this, that people would vote on this basis. The CNN reporter says, should a man's career end because of one vote? And my beautiful answer, he said, his career will end with that vote. Perfect. Now, the problem is, that reveals that you folks are getting a little bit uppity. You don't understand what your place is. Your place is to listen to our pretty speeches, and then every time we stab you in the back, clap your hands. That's your role. But some people are waking up and saying, you know what, I got just about enough stab wounds. I think I'm going to try something a little different. So my first piece of advice, I got 2 pieces of advice. Be careful, because the DC political machine wants you safely back on the plantation. They do not want a political movement that is not in their control. They want you in their hip pocket where they think you belong. But the problem with being in somebody's hip pocket is that you're likely to be sat on. They want to neuter you into insignificance. They want to get you supporting the plastic men that they trot out to you every 2 and 4 years. Please, I am begging you, for the love of this country, don't give them the satisfaction. Forget the pretty speeches. Look at action. Second, be fearless. There are some people who are shying away from events like this because the word nullification scares them. Oh, what will the media think if I go to this event? Well, you know what? What could the media possibly say about the Tea Parties they haven't said already? Right? That horse has left the stable. You might as well just go all out at this point, right? What have you got to lose? If you're going to stand up to the political establishment, you are going to need to have a thick skin. And if you don't, this is not the line of work for you. You should do something else. If you're going to take your cues from the media and political establishment, you've lost the battle before even starting. And it's true. This is a hot topic. A lot of people won't talk about it. On the cable news shows and a lot of right-wing radio, they will not touch this subject, at least not now. As it picks up, they'll all pretend that they were driving the bandwagon all along. The only person who's been consistently fearless, of course, is Judge Andrew Napolitano. And I'm convinced that once people hear this, particularly the Tea Party, once they hear the logic of it, it makes sense and people are ready to get on board. When Michael Bolden gave that beautiful Tea Party speech on April 15th out in California, he was talking to a group who had never heard of this stuff before. They didn't know where he was going with his speech. They sat there in stunned silence. And then by 3/4 of the way through, they're cheering like crazy. Like, hey, when do we get started? What can we nullify first? This is fantastic. Or in my case, there's another indication that this just needs a spark. You know, I've been on some TV, and a couple months ago, Glenn Beck did a show on F.A. Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom. And I was on for the whole hour for that show. Now, on that show, this book here, had not yet come out. So they flashed it on the screen, you know, just to identify me, I'm the author of this book. They flashed it on the screen for 3 seconds with no discussion, because we weren't talking about this book, we were talking about another book. So there's no discussion of the book, it's flashed on the screen. Flashing it on the screen makes it an Amazon bestseller. There was no other publicity. People may not know what nullification means, but when that word is stamped over a scene of Obama and his cronies signing the health care bill, they say, sign me up for this thing. Now, unfortunately, if only I could have had 5 minutes to talk about this particular book. Right? Well, someday that's bound to happen. As I say, the judge has been great to me. I mean, the judge is talking about nullification like crazy. He endorses it on the back cover. I've got Barry Goldwater Jr., who I think knows a little something about something, right? And then we've got Walter Williams, Rush Limbaugh's sit-in host. Now, if only we could get Rush himself on board. But be fearless. Prove yourselves worthy of the great men in whose footsteps you are walking. And be confident, because the other side's historical knowledge, I mean, really, Chris Matthews, is this guy a scholar? You know, you add up all the historical knowledge of Rachel Maddow, all these people, it fits inside like 1/3 of a thimble. We can laugh at these people, and we should. We need to make this funny. We can't look like you know, they want us to walk around with horns on our heads. That's why we got to be funny. And now, I'm not necessarily saying I'm so funny. But the one favor I want to ask you guys, other than at least consider the book, is this. When you go home, if you use the internet, I want you to go, and I know if Bolden is back there saying, I'm never going to let Woods speak again, he's 2 minutes over. I need just 3 more minutes, Michael, I apologize. But in any case, I want you to do this. I want you to go to this website. I actually purchased this domain name, believe it or not. I want you to go to interviewwithazombie.com. Some of you have seen this? Okay. This was a YouTube that a friend and I did in anticipation of this book coming out, because, you know, when you talk about the states, what's the first thing people say? Oh, you're a racist, you know, neo-Confederate, slavery defender, whatever, like a Nazi. Even though we just saw the Nazis are, like, these people don't even think, right? So I thought, well, I'm going to launch a preemptive strike against these people by, in effect, by having this video in which the host, the idea that it's a program hosted by a zombie. The idea is that this zombie has his own television talk show. So it kind of looks like a typical MSNBC program, right? In fact, people wrote to me and said, how did you ever get Keith Olbermann to interview you like that? That was great. And so the whole show, all he's doing is just throwing one word at a time at me. And it's all these left-wing smear words that are supposed to destroy me. And instead, I'm just giving him historical evidence. And all he can do is just continue with this. Well, this defangs them. Because whenever they try to do this to me, and I just point the whole world, I say, well, go to interviewwithazombie.com and see, this guy is just like the zombie. And one time since then that I have been attacked, in the comments section, everybody's going, hey, you zombie, and linking to the video. It's fantastic. We got to do stuff like this. Well, my friends, we have, for too long, expected some hero in Washington to put things right for us. But those heroes are in short supply. We need to put things right. And we can start in our own backyards with our own state legislatures. Forget about waiting for Washington to return our liberties. We have the tools to do so peacefully ourselves. For as Lord Byron said, who would be free themselves must strike the blow. Thank you very much.